When I began this series on churchy words, I shared how they get narrowed to set meanings. Like how faith generally now means assenting to a list of doctrines. And that fact in itself impacts how other words are heard, as a particular viewpoint becomes the only or perhaps the primary belief considered to be orthodox. That becomes the filter through which a word is heard. This is the case for the words I want to speak about today: suffering and sacrifice. Now, ironically, I'm guilty of what I just said in one of the words. Because in our gospel passage, well, Jesus tells his disciples how he must go to Jerusalem where he will suffer and be killed. He doesn't use the word sacrifice. Yet when I read how Jesus was going to be killed, that's how I heard Jesus. Equally, the reverse happens when you hear the word sacrifice in church and presume what's meant is Jesus' death. It's all very limiting. And for many, when we think of sacrifice and suffering as church words, really quite disquieting. So let's begin this expansion process by looking at how the word sacrifice is used in our general terms. Very often we think about someone who has died in the service of others. A mom dies saving her child. A firefighter runs back into a building that collapses. A soldier is killed in the line of duty. The root of sacrifice, the Latin, is sacra facere, meaning to make holy. And so what we're saying is these deaths are holy, they're righteous, because they happened in the service of others. Now, originally, sacrifice referred to religious rites, and especially when an animal was killed in an act of devotion to the gods or to God. The animal is set apart, so that only the gods or God can use it. It's made holy, and the one offering the animal is trying to sanctify their relationship with the gods. It's all about letting go of something, or even letting go of at least some, if not all of oneself in service of that greater relationship. Which is why in earlier times, as religion and society were so intertwined with each other, even more than now, it was considered honorable to die on the battlefield. You've given one's life in devotion, not just to the gods, but to the community itself. Now, of course, sacrifice isn't always about death. Consider the soldiers who are going through that fallen building in Beirut. They're placing themselves at risk, and so offering a sacrifice. We sacrifice for a cause. To fight climate change, we sacrifice our comfort. To mitigate the spread of COVID-19, we sacrifice our normal lives. To make peace, each side sacrifices something to gain common ground. And sacrifice is a willingness to die to self, to let go of oneself for others. But that lies at the heart of nonviolent resistance. Like Gandhi before him, Martin Luther King Jr. told his fellow activists not to fight back against the violence of the police. And we think of that now as a sacrifice, not just because they didn't fight back, but because at its heart their aim was to make holy how we see each other and how we treat each other as well. And for all of these reasons, Jesus' followers used the language of sacrifice when they spoke about his death. Now, at the time, they weren't thinking about all the various theologies of atonement, all the theories that bandy about. They were just trying to make sense of why he had died. After all, Peter wasn't alone in his assumption that the Messiah was going to bring salvation, more on that in a couple of weeks, through victory over the Romans. Jesus' suffering and execution should have been the end of the movement, but the movement didn't end. His teaching became more powerful because he gave his life for it. And as his followers spoke of his death in terms of redemption, that his death was holy, and more than that, that it somehow makes us holy, they were effectively redeeming his life and his message. Now, based on what I've shared so far, his death was a sacrifice for no other reason that the lives of his followers were saved because he chose not to resist arrest. But we've come to expand the meaning of the cross beyond that, to understand his death as an act of love for us all. So, there are many ways to interpret how this works, but I'll highlight one that I've shared with you before because it connects so much to what's going on in the world right now. I invite you to consider the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Chantel Moore, and too many others. As people hold up their pictures, kneel for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, say, "I can't breathe," as a rallying cry, they are making sure that their deaths were not in vain. Their deaths, in a sense, become redemptive as the grief and the anger are transformed into action. René Girard suggested that Jesus' death saves because it reveals our collective addiction to violence. It shocks us out of our complacency and makes us ponder what something new is possible. And this rings true when I consider how the death of George Floyd and others have highlighted the suffering of racialized people and has shocked white society into finally seeing how deeply entrenched racism is. So when we think about Jesus, we realize that his death was a deep crisis moment for his disciples, filled with much grief and anger and suffering. And as I shared last week, we need these crisis moments to move us from the established order, which is often rooted in a great ego focus, to imagine what is possible. The disciples realized that the new world Jesus was speaking about, the world he died for, was more profound than kicking out the Romans once and for all. His vision was a transformation of how we saw and treat each other. And this begins as we change how we see ourselves. Richard Rohr, I've preached about him before, suggests there are two experiences that help us to shift from a self-focus, this sense of specialness where all of our needs have to be met all the time, to see how our true nature is connected to others and connected to the one we call God, connected to love. Those experiences are love and suffering. They displace the ego at the center and help us to see divine presence at our very core and the core of everyone else's. To, in effect, as Hakim Sanai says, to sense the sweetness all around us. We well know that the world is in crisis. but as we see each other's pain in recognizing it in our own, we have a chance in this awakened connection to create something brand new. A world rooted in what Jesus lived and died for. A world of inclusive love, justice for all, true and lasting peace. Now, the crisis that I'm talking about, as I say, is often accompanied by suffering, but that's not for its own sake. We always need to lift the suffering of others. But it can be a door to our own spiritual growth. This is one way of seeing the invitation of Jesus to carry our cross. When embraced, we can let go of our life in order to gain real life. To see past the narrow view of our self-focus and ego and discover love at the center of all things. And we can prepare for this, again paraphrasing Sana'i, by taking time to let go of the constant voice of self and to listen to the silence that is God. In this way, various types of meditation, be it the silence of centering prayer or the rhythmic whirling of Sufism, the soul listening of Lectio Divina, or the embodied focus of yoga, whatever that meditation practice might be, in these I sacrifice the false self which clings constantly to separation and instead seek connection. I'm open to the love, open to God at the core of who I really am. And as we each rediscover our holiness, we can make our lives a sacrifice of praise. In other words, to serve others, to restore relationships, to seek a just and inclusive world. As I said, the words sacrifice and suffering, well, they can be very limiting, and in fact, can turn many of us off of religion altogether. But imagine, but doing what I can to make holy, to live out who we are in love, and intentionally seeking to open myself to that in my life. Well, if that's what we mean, well, those words just might be the very heart of spirituality. Amen.